The first time I saw the letter, I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near it. I was carrying 2 cups of coffee through the private dining room of Hawthorne House, the oldest restaurant in Boston, where crystal chandeliers reflected across polished mahogany tables and conversations were measured in whispers instead of laughter. The room wasn't reserved for celebrities. It was reserved for people who preferred never to appear in photographs. Museum trustees. Private collectors. University presidents. Old money families. And one man everyone noticed without daring to stare. Sebastian Knight. 37. Perfectly tailored charcoal suit. A quiet confidence that didn't ask for attention because it had never needed it. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He was simply the one everyone else adjusted themselves around. Rumors followed him everywhere. Shipping. Real estate. Private security. Some called him a businessman. Others used a different title when they thought nobody was listening. Mafia boss. I had never met him. I hoped I never would. My apologies. I placed the coffee beside an elderly historian whose hands trembled slightly as he reached for an ancient parchment resting beneath protective glass. Tonight's charity auction featured only one item. A letter discovered behind the stone wall of an abandoned monastery outside Florence. Carbon dating suggested it was more than 2 centuries old. No scholar had translated it. Not because the ink had faded. Because the language made no sense. Latin merged with forgotten dialects. Symbols appeared where words should have been. Entire sentences ignored every known grammatical rule. 3 universities had already failed. The room buzzed with polite disappointment. Professor Leonard Graves adjusted his glasses. As fascinating as the artifact is, I'm afraid we must conclude it remains undecipherable. Several guests nodded. Another collector sighed. A beautiful mystery. Someone laughed softly. Perhaps it was never meant to be understood. I should have walked away. Instead, one sentence caught my eye. Not because I recognized the letters. Because they felt strangely familiar. Like hearing a melody you haven't heard since childhood. Without thinking, I read it aloud. My voice was barely above a whisper. Yet every conversation in the room stopped. The pronunciation came naturally. Smoothly. As though my tongue had always known where each sound belonged. When I finished, silence settled over the dining room. No applause. No questions. Only silence. Professor Graves slowly stood. His face had lost every trace of color. Read. The second line. I don't know what it means. Just read it. I obeyed. Again the unfamiliar language flowed effortlessly. Not one hesitation. Not one mistake. The professor's notebook slipped from his hands. One woman quietly crossed herself. Another guest backed away from the table. I looked around, confused. What? No one answered. Instead, every eye turned toward Sebastian Knight. He hadn't touched his coffee. He hadn't looked at the letter. He had been watching me. The entire time. Finally, he spoke. What did you think you were saying? I searched for an honest answer. I don't know. I only knew how it sounded. For the first time, something cracked beneath his calm expression. Not fear. Recognition. Professor Graves reached for the parchment with trembling hands. That's impossible. Sebastian looked at him without blinking. Why? The professor swallowed hard. Because. He carefully rotated the ancient letter until its faded seal became visible beneath the glass. The language she's reading has never been recorded anywhere. Before anyone could react, the wax seal split apart on its own. A folded page, hidden inside the letter for more than 200 years, slowly slid onto the table. Across the top, written in the same impossible script, was one name. Amara Ellis. No one moved. The folded page rested on the polished mahogany table as though it had been waiting centuries for someone to notice it. I stared at my own name. Every instinct told me this had to be a trick. Someone's elaborate performance. Professor Leonard Graves reached for the page. Sebastian stopped him with one quiet sentence. Don't. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The professor froze. The room obeyed the silence that followed. Sebastian turned toward me. Miss Amara Ellis. I know. His answer unsettled me. Not because he recognized my name. Because he had spoken it before introducing himself. He carefully slid the hidden page across the table. I'm not asking you to translate it. What if I can't? Then nothing changes. And if I can? His gaze remained steady. Everything might. I looked down. The strange symbols no longer appeared chaotic. They flowed together like handwriting from an old family journal. Without understanding why, I began reading. The words arrived naturally. Not translated. Remembered. To the daughter whose voice awakens forgotten promises. The room seemed to shrink around me. If these words are heard, the guardians have failed, or finally succeeded. I stopped abruptly. My heartbeat thundered inside my ears. I don't know how I'm doing this. Professor Graves grabbed his notebook. Repeat every word. I can't. You just did. I wasn't thinking. Exactly. He looked almost frightened. Language requires memory. You cannot pronounce sounds that have never existed inside your mind. I've never seen this before. I believe you. That surprised me. He wasn't accusing me anymore. He sounded genuinely confused. The restaurant manager hurried into the private dining room. His expression changed the instant he realized every guest was staring at one waitress. Amara. His voice carried forced politeness. The kitchen needs you. Before I answered, Professor Graves interrupted. She isn't leaving. I'm afraid that's not your decision. It isn't yours either. The manager straightened. She's an employee. Sebastian finally stood. The movement alone silenced the room again. How much does she earn? The manager blinked. I don't believe that's relevant. It is to me. The number was quietly spoken. Sebastian removed a fountain pen from his pocket. He wrote a figure on his business card. Then slid it across the table. That's 6 months of her salary. The manager stared. I don't understand. You don't need to. I'd like to borrow her time. I immediately shook my head. I'm not for sale. Sebastian looked at me instead of the manager. I wasn't buying you. He pushed the card back toward himself. I was buying him the freedom to say yes. The distinction mattered. More than I expected. Outside, rain had begun falling across Boston. The city lights blurred against the restaurant windows. Sebastian opened the passenger door of a vintage black sedan. I didn't move. I barely know you. You shouldn't trust me. The answer caught me off guard. Then why ask me to come? Because trust isn't what I need tonight. What do you need? He looked toward the ancient letter now sealed inside a protective case. The truth. And you think I have it? I think. He hesitated for the first time. You may be the only person alive who can help me understand why my grandfather spent his entire life searching for someone named Amara Ellis. The rain suddenly felt colder. My grandmother's name wasn't Amara. My mother's wasn't either. I've never met anyone in my family with that name. Professor Graves stepped out of the restaurant carrying a tablet. His face had gone completely pale. I searched every birth record in Massachusetts. He swallowed hard before looking directly at me. There has never been another Amara Ellis born in this state. He turned the screen toward us. A newly scanned image filled the display. It wasn't the ancient letter. It was the final page hidden beneath it. Written in the same impossible language. Below, the translation software's failed attempts. One line appeared in perfect English. She must never discover who taught her to read. The sentence haunted me all night. She must never discover who taught her to read. It wasn't simply mysterious. It assumed something impossible. Someone believed I had learned a language that, according to every expert in the room, had never officially existed. By morning, the story had escaped the restaurant. Television vans parked outside. News websites called me the waitress who read the impossible letter. Half the country thought it was a miracle. The other half called me a fraud. My phone filled with unknown numbers. Some offered television interviews. Others accused me of staging the entire event. I ignored all of them. Until my manager didn't. "I'm sorry, Amara." He avoided my eyes while handing me a sealed envelope. "The owners think the attention is hurting the restaurant. So I'm fired. They're calling it temporary leave. Different words. Same result." I removed my apron for the last time. The dining room where I had worked for 4 years suddenly felt like a place that had never belonged to me. Outside, Sebastian was waiting beside his car. No bodyguards. No urgency. Just quiet patience. I heard. "I don't need charity." "I know." "Then why are you here?" He looked toward the restaurant. "Because someone wanted you unemployed." The certainty in his voice stopped me. "You think this was planned?" "I don't believe in coincidences involving ancient documents." He handed me a thin folder. Inside were newspaper clippings from 3 different decades. Every article described someone who had claimed to recognize fragments of the same mysterious language. A professor in Prague. A librarian in Lisbon. A monk in southern Italy. Every one of them had disappeared from public life within weeks. Not dead. Not missing. Simply, erased. Careers destroyed. Research revoked. Reputations dismantled. The final page contained one handwritten note from Sebastian's grandfather. "The language survives. Its readers do not." We drove to the Boston Athenaeum. Not the public reading rooms. A restricted archive beneath the oldest wing. Professor Graves was already waiting. His confidence from the night before had vanished. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "I spent 30 years believing the letter was a forgery." He unlocked a climate-controlled cabinet. Inside rested dozens of fragile journals donated anonymously over the past century. Every diary contained the same unfamiliar symbols. Every translation attempt ended halfway through. "I've never been able to read beyond the first page." He carefully pushed the nearest journal toward me. "I don't expect you to continue." Neither did I. Still. The moment my fingers touched the faded paper, the symbols settled into meaning. I began reading aloud. Not words. A conversation. A woman describing stars, tides, seasons, and memory as though they were chapters of the same story. Professor Graves stopped writing. Sebastian stopped breathing. I reached the final paragraph. Then froze. "What is it?" Sebastian asked quietly. I looked up. "This." I struggled to find the right words. "This isn't a language." The professor frowned. "What do you mean?" "It isn't describing history. It's giving instructions." "For what?" I turned another page. The answer made my hands tremble. "For teaching children. Before they're old enough to remember learning." Silence filled the archive. Not confusion. Recognition. Professor Graves slowly sat down. My God. Sebastian stared at the journals. My grandfather never searched for a translator. No. I whispered. He was searching for a teacher. Before anyone could speak again, the archive lights flickered. The security alarm activated. Heavy steel doors sealed every exit. A calm electronic voice echoed through the underground library. Restricted collection lockdown initiated. Then another voice came over the intercom. Human. Cold. Almost amused. Miss Ellis. Thank you for proving the letters still work. You've just led us to everything we were trying to find. The emergency lights painted the archive in alternating shades of amber and shadow. No one spoke. The electronic lock echoed through the underground halls with a final metallic click. Professor Graves hurried toward the nearest control panel. It shouldn't seal automatically. His fingers flew across the keypad. Nothing. Someone activated it remotely. Sebastian wasn't looking at the door. He was studying the shelves. Hundreds of journals. Centuries of forgotten handwriting. No panic crossed his face. Only calculation. They didn't lock us in. He spoke so quietly I almost missed it. They locked everyone else out. The realization settled heavily between us. Whoever controlled the building no longer wanted the letters hidden. They wanted us trapped with them. The voice returned through the speakers. Please remain calm. Security personnel are on their way. Professor Graves shook his head immediately. No. That isn't building security. How do you know? Because this archive has never been connected to the public address system. He slowly closed the oldest journal. Someone rewired the building. Years ago. Not tonight. Years. Sebastian glanced toward the ceiling. They've been waiting. For what? His eyes met mine. For someone who could actually read them. The weight of that sentence settled inside me. Not because it was frightening. Because it felt true. Arthur Vale arrived 3 minutes later. Not through the sealed entrance. Through a narrow service passage hidden behind a movable bookshelf. He was in his early 70s, dressed with understated elegance, carrying no weapon and no visible urgency. Yet Sebastian's guarded expression softened the moment he saw him. You came. I promised your grandfather I always would. Arthur looked at me with quiet curiosity. So you're Amara. You knew my name. I've known it for 30 years. Every answer created 2 new questions. He removed a small brass compass from his coat pocket and handed it to me. This belonged to your mother. I stared at him. My mother was a waitress. Yes. And she was also the only person your grandfather trusted after my generation. My mother never mentioned any of this. Arthur smiled sadly. Because keeping silent was part of the promise. We followed Arthur through the hidden passage. It ended inside a forgotten conservation studio beneath the archive. Unlike the grand reading rooms above, this space felt unfinished. Work tables. Dust-covered cabinets. Architectural drawings pinned to the walls. At the center stood a massive circular table carved with unfamiliar symbols. The same symbols from the letter. Without thinking, I traced one of them with my fingertips. A memory flashed. Not an image. A sensation. Warm sunlight. Someone laughing. A woman's voice repeating sounds slowly. Patiently. Teaching. I stepped back immediately. I've been here. Professor Graves frowned. That's impossible. I know. But I remember this room. Sebastian didn't dismiss me. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered. What exactly do you remember? I closed my eyes. The smell of old paper. A lullaby. And I hesitated. A man telling someone. Never teach the language through fear. Arthur's face changed. Not surprise. Recognition. He slowly sat down. Those were Jonathan Knight's exact words. Sebastian froze. My grandfather? Arthur nodded. He believed knowledge survived only when it was given freely. Sebastian looked away. I spent my entire life believing he built our family's influence through control. No. Arthur answered gently. He spent it trying to protect something that could never belong to one family. For several long moments, Sebastian said nothing. The strongest man in the room suddenly looked like a grandson discovering he had misunderstood the person he admired most. When he finally spoke, his voice carried neither anger nor pride. Only regret. I inherited his name. But not his wisdom. Before I could answer, the brass compass in my hand snapped open with a sharp metallic click. Hidden beneath the needle was a tiny strip of folded parchment. Only 6 handwritten words appeared inside. The teacher was never your mother. The words inside the compass refused to leave my mind. The teacher was never your mother. I read them again. Then again. Each time they seemed less like an answer and more like another door opening into darkness. Arthur closed the tiny parchment with extraordinary care. I hoped you wouldn't find that until much later. You knew it was there. Your mother asked me never to remove it. My mother knew about this? Arthur nodded. She knew enough to protect it. Not enough to understand all of it. Sebastian remained unusually quiet. He wasn't watching the compass. He was watching me. Not because he expected another miracle. Because he could see my entire understanding of my own life beginning to fracture. Arthur led us toward an oak cabinet hidden beneath the conservation studio. Inside were dozens of sealed audio cylinders, carefully restored alongside handwritten notebooks. Professor Graves lifted one gently. They're too fragile. Arthur smiled. They were never meant to be played. He handed me the notebook instead. No machine can translate what they contain. You have to read the instructions first. The symbols appeared before me once again. Different. Yet somehow familiar. I spoke only a few sentences. Nothing happened. Then I stopped. I wasn't reading words. What were you reading? Sebastian asked. I looked around the room. They're breathing instructions. Professor Graves frowned. For whom? For children. I slowly turned another page. The language was never taught through grammar. It was taught through rhythm. Memory. Voice. Arthur lowered his head. Exactly. No alphabet. No dictionaries. Only living teachers. The realization struck every person in the room simultaneously. The language had survived for centuries precisely because it had never depended on books. It depended on people. Sebastian walked toward one of the old journals. My grandfather spent 40 years protecting these. Arthur corrected him gently. He spent 40 years protecting the people. Sebastian looked almost embarrassed. I misunderstood everything. Arthur placed a weathered photograph into his hand. It showed Jonathan Knight standing beside several ordinary families. No expensive suits. No security. No wealth. Only teachers. Children. Community gatherings. There wasn't a secret society, Arthur said quietly. There was simply a promise. What promise? Never allow knowledge to become property. Sebastian stared at the photograph for a long time. My family built influence by owning things. Arthur shook his head. No. They survived because your grandfather kept giving things away. For the first time, Sebastian laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because he finally understood the contradiction that had haunted his family for generations. I spent my whole life defending an inheritance that was never supposed to belong to me. His voice carried relief more than regret. Something inside him had finally begun to loosen. I returned to the final notebook. One unfinished page remained. Unlike the others, it contained no symbols. Only a carefully drawn family tree. At the top stood one woman's name. Beneath it, generation after generation branched outward. Then, abruptly, every branch ended. Except one. A single line continued all the way to the bottom of the page. It stopped beside my name. Not because I inherited a fortune. Not because I carried noble blood. Because every other teacher had chosen someone else, and every one of those lines had quietly disappeared. Professor Graves whispered first. My God. Arthur closed his eyes. There was never a hidden language. There was always a hidden family. Before anyone could absorb the revelation, Sebastian unfolded one final envelope hidden beneath the family tree. Unlike every previous document, it wasn't addressed to me. It wasn't addressed to his grandfather. Across the front, written in the same ancient hand, were 8 words that changed everything we believed. Open only after the last teacher has been found. Sebastian held the unopened envelope without breaking the seal. No one urged him to hurry. For 2 centuries, it had survived untouched. Another minute would not matter. Arthur looked at the faded wax emblem. It was never meant for the strongest man. He looked at me. It was meant for the right one. I frowned. You think I should open it? I think the letter already made that decision. The room fell silent again. Not with fear. With reverence. I carefully lifted the brittle seal. Unlike the previous documents, this one contained no strange symbols. It was written in flawless English. If you have reached this page, then the language has already fulfilled its purpose. Professor Graves whispered, English. Arthur smiled faintly. They expected every other language to disappear eventually. They trusted this one to survive. I continued reading. The language was never created to preserve secrets. It was created to preserve conscience. Sebastian lowered his eyes. His grandfather had spent an entire lifetime protecting what he believed was an ancient code. Instead, it had always been an ethical inheritance. The letter continued. Every generation will mistake knowledge for power. Do not let them. Knowledge belongs only to those willing to share it. I looked toward the journals surrounding us. They weren't hiding history. Arthur nodded. They were protecting generosity. A heavy knock echoed from the sealed archive door. Not frantic. Measured. Someone knew exactly where we were. A woman's voice came through the security speaker. Boston Historical Crimes Unit. We have a warrant. Professor Graves looked relieved. They're finally here. Arthur didn't move. No. They're early. By almost 3 hours. Sebastian's expression hardened. You expected investigators. Arthur nodded. I arranged for them yesterday. They shouldn't arrive until evening. Another knock. More forceful. We know you're inside. Open immediately. Sebastian walked toward the reinforced door but stopped several feet away. What do you hear? I listened. At first. Nothing. Then. Very faintly. The rhythm of footsteps. Too synchronized. Not investigators entering a historic archive. Professionals clearing a building. I shook my head. Something's wrong. Sebastian immediately stepped away from the entrance. He didn't argue. He didn't demand proof. He trusted my instinct. It was the first time he had allowed another person's judgment to outweigh his own. Arthur noticed. So did I, quietly. Something inside him had changed. Professor Graves unfolded the final page. Hidden beneath the letter was an architectural drawing of the original monastery where the language had first been taught. Every classroom was marked. Every library identified. Except one chamber. It carried no title. Only one sentence. The last lesson is never written. I frowned. What does that mean? Arthur answered before anyone else could. It means every teacher eventually has to choose. Choose what? Whether to preserve the language. Or the people. The distinction settled heavily over us. For generations, every guardian had protected families instead of manuscripts. The books had survived because human lives mattered more than perfect records. Sebastian slowly folded the letter. My family spent decades believing we were protecting an artifact. Arthur looked directly at him. No. You were protecting the freedom to let it disappear if preserving it ever endangered innocent people. For the first time in his life, Sebastian understood the burden his grandfather had carried. Power had never been the inheritance. Responsibility had. He looked at me. If everything here vanished tomorrow, would the language survive? I thought about my mother. The restaurant. The ordinary life I believed I had lived. Then I answered honestly. Yes. Because it was never trapped inside these pages. It survives every time someone chooses truth over possession. A faint smile crossed Sebastian's face. Not triumph. Peace. Then every light inside the archive went dark. Emergency generators failed. The reinforced door slowly unlocked by itself. And from somewhere beyond the darkness, an elderly woman's calm voice echoed through the corridor. Amara. I've been waiting 26 years to finish teaching you. The voice belonged to a woman no one recognized. Yet the moment I heard it, something inside me answered before my mind could. Not recognition. Longing. The emergency lights slowly returned, casting a soft amber glow across the corridor. An elderly woman stepped forward without hesitation. She wore a simple navy wool coat over a cream dress, walking with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent her life entering rooms without asking permission. No security escorted her. No one tried to stop her. Arthur stood first. His eyes filled with emotion. I never thought you'd come. She smiled gently. I promised Jonathan I would only come when the last teacher was ready. Sebastian stared at Arthur. You know her? Arthur nodded. Her name is Eleanor Ashcroft. The final living guardian. I looked at her in disbelief. You taught me? She shook her head. No. I protected the person who did. Every answer continued to reshape my past. Eleanor approached me slowly. When you were 3 years old, your mother brought you to me every Sunday. I searched desperately through my memories. I don't remember. You weren't supposed to. She smiled with quiet warmth. We never taught children through memorization. We taught them through rhythm. Stories. Songs. Compassion. She gently touched the ancient compass resting in my hand. You believed they were bedtime games. They were lessons. A single tear escaped before I could stop it. My mother lied to me. No. Eleanor answered softly. She protected your freedom. You deserved the chance to become a good woman before discovering why. Sebastian remained silent throughout the conversation. I finally turned toward him. What are you thinking? He laughed quietly. I've spent 15 years believing my family inherited power. He looked around the archive. And today I discover they inherited responsibility. His honesty surprised even him. I don't know who I am without that illusion. I stepped closer. You don't lose yourself by learning the truth. You finally get the chance to choose. He looked at me for several long seconds. No dramatic confession. No sudden romance. Only quiet understanding. For the first time, someone had offered him a future instead of expecting him to defend his past. Professor Graves suddenly interrupted. The journals. He hurried toward the central table. Several pages had begun fading before our eyes. The ink wasn't disappearing. It was changing. Ancient symbols slowly transformed into ordinary English. Arthur looked horrified. No. Eleanor smiled. Yes. The work is finished. What does that mean? Sebastian asked. She picked up one of the transformed journals. The language was designed to vanish. Silence filled the room. She continued. Once the final teacher understood its purpose, there would never be another need to hide it. Professor Graves looked devastated. 200 years of linguistic history. Gone. Eleanor gently shook her head. No. It isn't disappearing. It is becoming understandable. Knowledge was never meant to remain exclusive. Its final lesson was accessibility. The greatest secret had never been the language itself. It was knowing when to stop protecting it. A phone vibrated inside Arthur's coat. He answered. His expression changed immediately. What happened? No one spoke while he listened. Finally, he lowered the phone. The Historical Preservation Authority. They've frozen every private claim connected to the archive. Professor Graves smiled with relief. So it's finally protected. Arthur slowly shook his head. No. It's being transferred. To whom? He looked directly at me. To the only documented living teacher. The room turned toward me. Before I could respond, Eleanor quietly removed a sealed envelope from her handbag. Unlike every previous letter, this one was new. The ink had barely dried. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, were 7 words that made even Eleanor's steady hands tremble. Do not open until Sebastian forgives himself. The envelope remained unopened. Not because no one was curious. Because every person in the room understood that some truths demanded preparation before they deserved discovery. Sebastian looked at the 7 words written across the front. Do not open until Sebastian forgives himself. He almost laughed. I wouldn't know where to begin. Eleanor stepped beside him. You already have. He looked confused. I've done nothing. You listened. For the first time in your life, you stopped defending your family's mistakes and started understanding their intentions. She smiled gently. That is where forgiveness begins. Morning sunlight slowly reached the archive windows. Outside, the city was waking. Inside, centuries of silence were finally ending. Representatives from the Historical Preservation Authority arrived with archivists, conservation specialists, and legal observers. No one argued over ownership. No one reached for contracts. Instead, every document was photographed, catalogued, and preserved in full public view. The secrecy that had protected the language for generations had fulfilled its purpose. Now transparency would protect it better than silence ever could. Professor Graves watched the process quietly. I spent 30 years trying to become the first man to understand these journals. He looked at me and smiled. It turns out I was supposed to become the last man who needed to. Reporters gathered outside the Athenaeum before noon. Microphones. Satellite trucks. Breaking news banners. They expected another scandal. Another billionaire fighting for control. Another priceless discovery disappearing into a private collection. Instead, Sebastian walked to the podium alone. No lawyers. No prepared statement. I was raised to believe that protecting something meant owning it. He paused. My grandfather spent his life trying to teach the opposite. The cameras remained perfectly still. Today my family withdraws every legal claim connected to the archive. A murmur spread across the crowd. The collection will belong to a public educational trust. One reporter raised a hand. Mr. Knight, are you giving away a fortune? Sebastian answered without hesitation. No. I'm returning a promise. Later that afternoon, we stood inside the conservation studio one final time. Workers carefully packed the journals for transfer. The room that had guarded history for centuries suddenly felt lighter. Sebastian picked up the unopened envelope. I think I'm ready. Eleanor nodded. So is the letter. He carefully broke the seal. Inside rested only a single page. No ancient symbols. No riddles. Just Jonathan Knight's familiar handwriting. Sebastian, if this letter has reached you, then someone extraordinary helped you become the man I hoped our family would one day deserve. He stopped reading. His hands trembled. Not from fear. From relief. He continued. Do not spend your life correcting my mistakes. Spend it creating fewer of your own. And if the last teacher is standing beside you, listen when she reminds you that kindness always outlives control. Sebastian lowered the letter. For several moments he couldn't speak. Then he quietly folded it and placed it back inside the envelope. I've spent years trying to become stronger than my grandfather. His eyes met mine. I should have been trying to become kinder. I smiled. I don't think those are different goals. For the first time since we met, he didn't answer with certainty. He answered with gratitude. Thank you. Not for translating the letter. Not for solving the mystery. For changing the question he had been asking himself all his life. As the final journal was lifted from the table, Arthur suddenly frowned. There should be one more. Professor Graves checked the inventory. Everything has been accounted for. Arthur slowly shook his head. No. The very first journal. The one Jonathan carried everywhere. Silence returned. Eleanor looked toward the empty wooden stand in the center of the room. Someone had removed it. Not recently. Years ago. Tucked beneath the stand lay a fresh white envelope that none of us had seen before. There was no wax seal. No ancient handwriting. Only one simple sentence written in modern black ink. The first journal was never lost, it has been reading all of you. 1 year later, the doors of the Hawthorne Institute for Living Heritage opened to the public for the first time. The building had once been an abandoned courthouse overlooking Boston Harbor. Now sunlight filled its restored halls. Children laughed where arguments had once echoed. Every classroom stood behind glass walls. Nothing hidden. Nothing exclusive. The journals rested inside climate-controlled displays. Not because they belonged to history. Because they belonged to everyone willing to learn from it. Above the entrance, a single sentence welcomed every visitor. Knowledge grows stronger the moment it stops belonging to one person. Professor Graves paused beneath those words longer than anyone else. I spent my career searching for a forgotten language. He smiled softly. I never realized it was searching for better people. The newspapers still introduced Sebastian Knight the same way. Former Mafia boss. Business magnate. Private investor. Public labels changed slowly. He no longer tried to correct them. Instead, he quietly sold the last businesses built on intimidation and redirected their profits into libraries, archives, neighborhood schools, and scholarship programs. People expected dramatic redemption. He chose ordinary consistency instead. One careful decision after another. Arthur often joked that Jonathan Knight would have approved. Sebastian always answered the same way. I hope one day he'd simply recognize me. That hope mattered more than reputation ever had. As for me, I never returned to waiting tables. Not because I was ashamed of where I had started. Because another door had quietly opened. I became the Institute's first director of living traditions. Not a curator. Not an owner. A steward. My responsibility was never to protect old documents from people. It was to make sure people never felt unworthy of learning from them. Schoolchildren filled the classrooms every week. No passwords. No secret societies. No impossible examinations. Only stories. Songs. Questions. Exactly as Eleanor had once described. The language had finally completed its purpose. Not preserved. Shared. One quiet autumn afternoon, Sebastian found me arranging children's drawings beside one of the original journals. They're replacing priceless manuscripts with crayon pictures. He smiled. They're adding to them. I corrected. He laughed. I still have a lot to learn. You always will. So will you. Neither of us reached for grand declarations. Our relationship had never been built on dramatic promises. It had been built one conversation at a time. One difficult truth at a time. One deliberate choice to trust instead of assume. He handed me a folded piece of paper. No ancient symbols this time. I opened it. It wasn't another mystery. It was a reservation confirmation. A small family-owned restaurant overlooking Boston Harbor. The date was tonight. The note beneath it read, no history. No investigations. Just dinner. I looked up. Is this your way of asking me on a first date? He smiled with the quiet confidence that no longer came from power. I think we've earned a normal beginning. For the first time since the ancient letter entered my life. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary. I accepted. As the Institute prepared to close for the evening, Eleanor quietly approached the oldest display case. Inside rested the original letter that had changed all our lives. She looked at it for a long moment before whispering almost to herself, it finally reached the right reader. Arthur heard her. So the prophecy was true? She smiled gently. There was never a prophecy. There was only faith. Faith that somewhere, someday, an ordinary young waitress would choose curiosity over fear. The lights dimmed across the Institute. Visitors slowly stepped outside. Children carried handmade notebooks instead of souvenirs. Sebastian waited patiently by the front doors. I joined him. Together we walked into the cool Boston evening without looking back. The ancient letter remained behind the glass. No longer waiting to be understood. It had already fulfilled its promise. Because the greatest mystery was never the language that nobody else could understand. It was discovering that wisdom survives only when an ordinary person has the courage to read it aloud, and an extraordinary person has the humility to listen.